Number 3. Danny Keith Hooks. On May 16, 1992, around 1:30 p.m., a man went to a house in one of the rougher areas of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, looking for his girlfriend. 35-year-old Sandra Thompson was renting the house. It was often described as a crack house. When the man got to the house, he found a disturbing crime scene, so he called the police. In a small bedroom, there were 5 dead bodies. One of the bodies was the resident, 35-year-old Sandra Thompson. The other 4 were 47-year-old Phyllis Adams, 37-year-old Carolyn Watson, 34-year-old Francel Roberts, and 30-year-old LaShawn Evans. All the women were nude and gagged. 3 of the women, Thompson, Watson, and Roberts, were bound. They had all been stabbed to death. The police searched the house and didn't find any drugs or money. The women's purses had all been rifled through. Based on the evidence, the police believe that a single person committed the murders. Having all 5 women in one confined space would have made it easier for one person to control the situation. Also, only one set of bloody footprints was found. The word honchos were embossed on the sole of the boots. The police determined that the prints came from a work boot. Except for the footprints, the victim's blood was mostly in the bedroom. But the police also found a blood trail outside the bedroom. In the bedroom, they found a bloody palm print on the closet door. They also found some blood drops on the bedroom floor that didn't appear to come from any of the victims. In Francel Roberts' mouth, they found semen. Samples of the blood from the blood trail, the palm print, the blood drops, and the semen were kept and stored. 3 years later, some of the blood was sent for DNA testing. It was determined that the blood belonged to a man, but the police did not know who that man was. So the following year, 1996, the profile was sent to databases throughout the country. In early 1997, the California penal authorities contacted the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation. They had a match to the DNA. He was 38-year-old Danny Keith Hooks. Hooks had a history of violent crimes. On July 5, 1987, Hooks stabbed a man in the heart in California. The man survived the assault. In November of that year, he kidnapped and raped a woman at knife point. The following year, he pleaded guilty to assault with a deadly weapon, rape, and kidnapping regarding those crimes. He was paroled in 1991 after serving about 3 years. Before he left prison, he had to give a sample of his blood and saliva for DNA profiling. Hooks was described as a crack cocaine addict with a violent temper and a craving for group sex. The police learned that Hooks lived a bit of a transient lifestyle. At the time of the murders, he was living with his brother just a few miles from the crime scene. He left Oklahoma 2 weeks after the murders. About 5 months after the murders, he was arrested in Holdenville, Oklahoma, which is about 75 miles from Oklahoma City, for a domestic dispute. Since he was on parole in California, he was sent back to the state. In February 1997, after learning Danny Hooks' DNA connected him to the massacre, the police arrested him in San Jose, California. He was then extradited to Oklahoma. Further DNA testing was done on the blood and the semen. It was all Hooks' blood, and the semen was consistent with Hooks' DNA. Also, his handprint matched the bloody handprint found on the closet door. Witnesses also placed Hooks in the house because he bought crack there. However, the police never found the boots with honchos embossed on the soles. But witnesses said that around the time of the murders, Hooks did wear work boots. Also, he was in a casual relationship with one of the victims, LaShawn Evans. After Hooks was arrested, he was interrogated. He admitted that he frequented the house and was even there on the night of the murders. He smoked crack there and had sex with some of the victims. He claimed that he left around 2 a.m. He decided to come back to the house around 4 a.m. Along the way, he stopped to fix his bike's kickstand and he cut his finger. When he got back to the house, he was still bleeding, and this is how his blood got into the house. He discovered the bodies but didn't call the police because he was on parole. He thought he'd get his parole revoked because he was in a drug house. So he left and didn't tell anyone what he saw. The police did not believe his story. Hooks went to trial in September 1998, over 6 years after the mass murder. The prosecution described Hooks as a violent drug addict. They talked about his criminal record, which involved rape and violence. Hooks' ex-wife testified, and she said that Hooks was violent. He had broken her ribs and a vertebra. A woman who was dating Hooks at the time of the murders also testified. She said he left to buy drugs and never returned. The prosecution theorized that Hooks went to the house and wanted to have group sex. The woman resisted and he snapped. He forced them to tie each other up. He then stabbed all of them. Hooks testified on his own behalf. He told the story about cutting himself before coming to the house, and that's why his blood was at the crime scene. The trial lasted just over a week. After a day of deliberation, the jury was deadlocked at 10-2. The judge told them to continue deliberating. After 12 total hours of deliberation, they reached a unanimous decision. They found Danny Hooks guilty of all 5 murders. He was given 5 death sentences. Hooks spent the next 12 years on death row. Then in May 2010, the Oklahoma Appeals Court overturned his death sentence. The panel of 3 judges concluded that the prosecution made misstatements, and this coerced the jurors into choosing the death penalty. Also, the judge should not have ordered the jury to continue deliberating after they had reported they were deadlocked. In 2014, Hooks was sentenced to life in prison without parole. At the time of this video, 65-year-old Danny Hooks is serving his sentence at the Oklahoma State Reformatory in Granite, Oklahoma. Number 2. Victor Ernest Hoffman and Frederick Moses McCallum. Shell Lake is a small village in central Saskatchewan, Canada. In 1967, it was home to only 250 people. The Pearson family lived on a farm just outside the village. James Pearson had served in World War II. During the war, he was captured, but ultimately he escaped. When he returned to Canada, he didn't like talking about his war experiences. In 1967, James was 47 years old, and his wife, Evelyn, was 42. They had 9 children together. Their oldest daughter was about 19 and lived in British Columbia, Canada, with her husband. The rest of the children lived at home. The family generally kept to themselves, but they were well liked in the village. On the morning of August 15, 1967, a neighbor went to the farm to help with the haying. He was surprised to see that there was no activity on the farm. He thought that the family had just slept in. He got into the kitchen and found the dead body of 47-year-old James Pearson on the floor. He had been shot 11 times. The neighbor looked around the house and it appeared that the other 9 family members had all been murdered as well. The neighbor got into the family station wagon, drove 3.5 miles to the nearest phone, and called the police. At the time, only 2 officers worked in the area. The officers went to the house. In the backyard, just under a window, was the dead body of 42-year-old Evelyn. She had been shot 5 times. In her arms was the dead body of the youngest Pearson, Larry, who was just 1.5 years. In the beds, they found the dead bodies of the other children, 17-year-old Jean, 13-year-old Mary, 11-year-old Dorothy, 9-year-old Pearl, 5-year-old William, and 2-year-old Colin. All the children had been shot in the head. Only one member of the family, 4-year-old Phyllis, was unharmed. The police found her hiding under bed sheets in the bed between the dead bodies of her siblings. Phyllis talked to her uncle, and she said that one man had killed the family, but she did not recognize him. The murders haunted the community and baffled the police. The Pearson family didn't have any enemies, so why would someone break into the house and slaughter them? The police continued to investigate the murders. Then, 3 days after the murders, the police received a tip from a man living in Leesk, which is about 60 miles from Shell Lake. He said that his neighbor, 21-year-old Victor Ernest Hoffman, had been released from a psychiatric hospital just a few weeks earlier. The man said that Hoffman also liked to hunt. The police decided to follow up on the lead. They searched the Hoffman family farm. In a car, they found a .22 caliber Belgian Browning pump-action repeater rifle. They took it for ballistic testing. The next day, the police in the area were informed it was the murder weapon. 21-year-old Victor Hoffman was arrested for the 9 murders. In custody, he confessed to the murders. He was remanded to a psychiatric hospital where he talked to several doctors about his life and the murders. Hoffman was one of 7 children. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade and was considered a loner. Hoffman said that when he was 6 years old, he started seeing the devil. He said that the devil was tall and black. He had no genitals and he had a long tail that was dark as night. He also saw angels and received messages from God. On May 28, 1967, several months before the murders, Hoffman fired a gun into the air. He ran and told his mother he had shot the devil. His mother saw that something was deeply wrong with her son. She convinced him to drop the gun. Hoffman then got into a car and drove away. While he was gone, his family hid the guns. When Hoffman returned about half an hour later, he asked to speak to a priest. A priest came over and talked to Hoffman. The priest told Hoffman's parents that he was very sick and needed to be treated by a doctor. So Hoffman was placed in a psychiatric hospital. He was released 3 weeks before the murder of the Peterson family. After Hoffman was arrested for the murders, he told a doctor that before he was committed to the hospital, he often felt the temptation to murder someone, but he was always able to quell those urges. After he was released from the hospital, he thought about murder daily. He considered murdering his parents, siblings, and strangers. On the morning of the massacre, he woke up early in the morning and couldn't get back to sleep. So he got some shells, put the rifle in his truck, and drove around. He passed several houses and felt the urge to kill, but he was able to fight it. He then turned into the driveway of the Pearson family, who were strangers to him. He said that the devil told him to enter the home. He went into James and Evelyn's bedroom. He said that if James had talked to him calmly and told him to leave, he would have. But he said that James started a fight with him. James pushed him out of the bedroom and into the kitchen. Hoffman said that as James pushed him, he kept shooting him. James finally went down. Hoffman went to the truck and reloaded his gun. He then went back into the kitchen and delivered the kill shot to James. Hoffman said that he heard Evelyn climb out the window. He went outside and found her in the backyard. She said, "Don't murder me." Hoffman said that he shot her multiple times as she held the baby. He then went inside and shot 6 of the kids. He said he shot them in the head because he didn't want to leave any bullets behind. He planned on cutting off their heads and taking the heads with him. But then he saw that the bullets were going through their heads, so he decided against that plan. He said that he didn't shoot Phyllis because she was hiding under a bedsheet and would not be able to identify him. He later said that he didn't kill her because she had the face of an angel. He then went back outside to Evelyn's body and she was still holding 1-year-old Larry. Hoffman said that he shot Larry because he thought it'd be a few days before the bodies were found and he didn't want the child to die from dehydration or starvation. He drove home and considered taking his own life, but he couldn't go through with it. Not long after Hoffman was remanded to the hospital, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Victor Hoffman went to trial in January 1967. He He was just being tried for the murders of James and Evelyn. The trial lasted 4 days, and the jury deliberated for 3.5 hours. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was sent to a psychiatric institution. At some point, he was transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Penetanguishene, Ontario. Journalist Peter Tadman published a book about the murders, Shell Lake Massacre, in 1992. For the book, he interviewed Hoffman several times. Hoffman said he didn't feel guilty about the murders. He believed that the devil made him do it. In the 1990s, Hoffman was allowed to go on supervised leaves from the hospital. Victor Hoffman died in May 2004 from cancer while still in custody. He was 57 years old. After the murders, Phyllis, the lone survivor, was raised by her oldest sister, Kathy. In an interview with the CBC for the 50th anniversary of the massacre, Phyllis said that she received unusual attention when people found out she survived the mass murder. She said, "You just can't be normal." The eldest Pearson child, who didn't live at the house at the time of the murders, Kathy, was interviewed for a podcast about the murders. She was asked if she forgave Victor Hoffman. She said, "If you don't, you've got that hatred in you all your life, and that ruins everything. I'm not going to let him spoil my life. He's taken enough. You're not taking any more." Sadly, this is not the only massacre to happen in a village in the peaceful, tranquil province of Saskatchewan in the late 1960s. 17 months after the Pearsons were killed, there was another one in Buffalo Narrows. Buffalo Narrows is a village in northern Saskatchewan. In 1969, its population was about 700. Scandinavian traders established it in the 1900s as a settlement for trapping, mink ranching, and fishing. Many of the residents worked in those industries. Buffalo Narrows is about 220 miles north of Shell Lake. Buffalo Narrows was home to 32-year-old Thomas Peterson, his 32-year-old wife, Burnett Peterson, and their 7 children. Although their names were similar, the two families were not related. The Petersons in Shell Lake spelled their name Peterson, and the Peterson family in Buffalo Narrows spelled their name Pederson. The family lived in what was described as a modern, 2-bedroom house. On the night of January 29, 1969, the family had a party at their home. A family friend, 48-year-old John Herman, was spending the night at the family's home. It was a cold, snowy night, with temperatures reaching -40. Early on the morning of January 30th, 1969, the police in the area received a disturbing phone call. It was a local Catholic priest. He said that one of his parishioners had called him and told him he had killed the family. The priest said that the caller told him to get to the house right away because some of the girls might still be alive and he could give them their last rites. Officers went to the house and the priest was already there. They found what was described as a house of horrors. On the living room floor was the dead body of 48-year-old John Herman. In the beds were 32-year-old Thomas Peterson, his 32-year-old wife, Bernadette, and 5 of their 7 children, 8-year-old Grace Ann, 7-year-old Donald Frederick, 5-year-old Robert Thomas, 4-year-old Richard Daniel, and 2-year-old Rhonda Beatrice. The other 2 children, 11-year-old Cynthia and 10-year-old Connie, were at their grandmother's home that night. The attacks were brutal. They had all been hacked with a long-handled axe, which was found leaning up against a wall. Some of their faces were missing, and the tops of some of their heads were chopped off. The police were shocked when they discovered that not everyone was dead. 32-year-old Bernadette and 7-year-old Douglas were severely injured, but they were alive. They were rushed to the hospital. Bernadette died 4 hours later. Donald had a skull fracture. He ended up being in a coma for several months, but ultimately survived. About half an hour after the discovery of the bodies, the police went to the home of the man who called the priest, 19-year-old Frederick McCallum. McCallum lived in Buffalo Narrows with his aunt. He was one of 9 children who all had different fathers. His mother rarely gave him enough food or dressed him warmly. When McCallum was 11, he was placed in foster care. He eventually went to live with his aunt, and it was thought that he gained some stability while living there. As a boy, he played hockey and he was an altar server. As an adult, he worked as a fisherman and had other jobs in the village. When the police arrived at McCallum's home, they found him drinking tea. An officer told McCallum he was under arrest for murder. McCallum responded by saying, "Sure, I killed them, so what?" He was then arrested. He later told the police that he hoped he would get the electric chair. McCallum had been at the party at the Pearsons' house hours earlier, and he had been drinking. At some point, he was told to leave, and he felt slighted. So after everyone fell asleep, he went back to the house and hacked everyone with the axe. Frederick McCallum went to trial in October 1969. He was initially charged with 7 counts of non-capital homicide. It was decided that he would only be tried for 2 counts of non-capital homicide. They were the murders of 48-year-old John Herman and 32-year-old Thomas Peterson. At the trial, McCallum claimed he had regrets, but it was that he regretted not wiping out the entire family. The axe was then entered into evidence. It had McCallum's fingerprints on it. During McCallum's trial, a psychiatrist told the court that he had schizophrenia. The psychiatrist had also asked McCallum what he thought of 21-year-old Victor Hoffman, the Shell Lake killer. McCallum said, "I'd kill him the day I got my hands on him. I couldn't see shooting an infant." However, it should be noted that the youngest person Hoffman killed was a 1.5 years, and McCallum killed a 2-year-old. The trial lasted about a week, then the jury deliberated for 4.5 hours. Frederick McCallum was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was placed in the Prince Albert Penitentiary in 1970 and eventually transferred to another institute for the criminally insane in Penetanguishene, Ontario. In 1989, 20 years after the murders, Frederick McCallum was given an absolute release. Saskatchewan's chief prosecutor, Serge Kawaja, the lawyer who prosecuted McCallum, claimed he did an outstanding job with the recovery. The only condition of McCallum's release is that he could never return to Saskatchewan. Understandably, the murders affected the surviving Peterson children's lives. Connie and Cynthia, who weren't at home during the mass murder, were given little support for their mental health. They recall getting 1 2-hour session of counseling. In a February 2019 article about the 50th anniversary of the murders, the sisters said that their family's tragedy has been ignored and forgotten. Donald Peterson, the lone survivor, had a rough life growing up. He spent time in a boys' home in northern Saskatchewan and served time in prison. He said he wanted to be put in the same prison as McCallum so he could confront him. But by the time he was old enough to be put in an adult facility, McCallum was in a facility over 3,000 miles away in a different province. Donald eventually settled down. He got married and had children. In 1987, Donald, Cynthia, and their uncle were driving on a beach road in Buffalo Narrows. A vehicle passing them accidentally clipped their side mirror. They all got out of the vehicle to investigate. Then, in a freak accident, an oncoming vehicle struck Cynthia. She was thrown into Donald, and he was killed. He was only 26 years old. Cynthia spent months in the hospital, but ultimately survived. As of 2024, Frederick McCallum's status and his whereabouts are unknown. If he is alive, he would be about 74 years old. Number 1. Francisco Gonzales. In the spring of 1964, 27-year-old Francisco Paulo Gonzales, a native of the Philippines, was living in San Francisco, California. This is just 4 years after he competed in the Olympics as a member of the Philippines sailing team. His team finished 24th. In that spring of 1964, his life was not going well. He was working at a factory, but he was deeply in debt. Half of his paycheck was going to pay off his debts. He was also having marital problems. Some people in Gonzales' life thought he was mentally unstable. He told many family members that he was going to kill them and then kill himself. Eventually, he started specifically telling people he was going to die on May 6th or May 7th. On May 6, 1974, Gonzales purchased a .357 Magnum from a friend of a friend. He then flew to Reno, Nevada, where he spent the night gambling in casinos. As he gambled, he told a casino employee it didn't matter how much he lost because it would not matter tomorrow. After a night at the casinos, Gonzales went back to the airport. He took out 2 life insurance policies on himself, totaling $105,000. The beneficiary of the insurance policies was his wife. Gonzales then boarded Pacific Airlines Flight 773 heading to San Francisco with a stop in Stockton, California. At 5:54 a.m., the plane took off with 33 passengers and 3 crew members. It landed in Stockton, where 2 people deboarded and 10 got on. At 6:28 a.m., the plane took off from Compton with 41 passengers and 3 crew members. 10 minutes later, the Oakland Air Route Traffic Control Center received a garbled message from the co-pilot. He said, "Skipper's shot, we've been shot, trying to help." Then the radio went dead. Air traffic control became concerned, so they sent a plane to the area where they received the last transmission. The pilot reported that Pacific Airlines Flight 773 had crashed into a hillside. Emergency responders were dispatched to the area. But when they arrived, it was clear that all 44 people on board were dead. The Civil Aeronautics Board investigated the crash. 6 months after the devastating crash, the Civil Aeronautics Board released its report. They concluded that 27-year-old Francisco Paulo Gonzales brought the gun he purchased days earlier onto the plane. He got into the cockpit and shot both the pilot and co-pilot. He then turned the gun on himself. After the pilots were shot, the plane went into a sharp descent. It crashed into the hillside. It was the first time in the United States that a passenger killed a pilot and co-pilot in a murder-suicide. It led to new laws for airline security, like restricting firearms. With 43 victims, it was the biggest mass murder committed by an individual until October 1st, 2017. That's when Stephen Paddock opened fire on concertgoers at a country music festival on the Las Vegas Strip from his hotel room and indiscriminately killed 60 people. Another 422 were injured by gunfire, and a further 429 more were injured in the chaos that was caused by the shooting. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out our new channel, Paranormally Listed. There's a link on the screen now, and there's a link in the description box below this video. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.